In 1992, Carolyn Warmus was convicted of what the media dubbed the fatal attraction murder. The public was told a simple story. A jealous schoolteacher, obsessed with her married lover, snapped and gunned down his wife in cold blood. It was the kind of narrative Hollywood could have written. In fact, the case was constantly compared to the movie Fatal Attraction, starring Glenn Close and Michael Douglas. The media embraced the label. Prosecutors ran with it, and the public believed every word. But here's the question that haunts this case. What if the real story wasn't about a fatal attraction, but a fatal investigation? Thank you to all our loyal viewers and subscribers. Your support means everything. We're here every day with gripping true crime stories, deep dives, and the chilling details you won't hear anywhere else. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss an update. Because here at True Crime Vault, we don't just tell stories, we uncover the truth. Over the next several minutes, we'll uncover shocking police errors, questionable evidence, and decades of unanswered questions that suggest the wrong person may have spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. The crime at the center of this story took place on January 15, 1989, in Greenburgh, New York. Betty Jeanne Solomon, a 40-year-old wife and mother, was found brutally murdered in her own home, shot 9 times in her living room. Her husband, Paul Solomon, was a high school teacher who appeared to be living a stable suburban life. But beneath that polished image, he was keeping a dangerous secret. Paul was having an affair with another teacher at his school, a 25-year-old named Carolyn Warmus. To understand this case, you need to know who Carolyn Warmus really was. She wasn't the unhinged stalker the media later portrayed, at least, not initially. Carolyn was the daughter of a wealthy insurance executive from Michigan. She grew up privileged, attended prestigious schools, and eventually became an elementary school teacher in Westchester County. Colleagues describe her as attractive, ambitious, and charming. She was also lonely. At 25, she began an affair with Paul Solomon, a man 12 years her senior, married with a teenage daughter. Paul gave Carolyn the attention she desperately craved, but their relationship was built on quicksand. He bounced between promises and excuses, while Carolyn became increasingly invested in a man who refused to leave his wife. This toxic triangle, Paul, Betty Jeanne, and Carolyn, set the stage for tragedy. In any murder investigation, the most sacred rule is this: protect the crime scene. Every object, every fingerprint, every fiber could hold the answer to who pulled that trigger. That evidence must be preserved with military precision. But that didn't happen here. Instead of sealing the Solomon home, police allowed friends and family members to walk through the apartment freely. People touched furniture. They moved objects. Some may have even stepped over Betty Jeanne's body before the forensic team finished their work. Most shocking of all, reports suggest that Paul Solomon himself had blood on his hands when police arrived, and yet, investigators allowed him to wash it away. Think about that for a moment. If Betty Jeanne fought her killer, or if Paul was the shooter, that blood could have contained gunshot residue or DNA from a struggle. Instead, it was washed away forever. This wasn't just sloppy police work, it was catastrophic. A contaminated crime scene cast doubt on every single piece of evidence collected. When a wife is murdered, experienced investigators almost always start with a husband. Statistics don't lie. Intimate partners are responsible for the majority of domestic homicides. Paul Solomon had multiple red flags. He was cheating on his wife. He stood to gain from Betty Jeanne's life insurance policy, and he admitted to being one of the last people to see her alive. Yet police treated Paul with surprising gentleness. Instead of considering him their prime suspect, they quickly began viewing him as a cooperative witness. Soon, Paul would become more than just a witness. He would become the prosecution's star witness against Carolyn Warmus. Why did police shift their focus so quickly from Paul to Carolyn? Part of it came down to Paul's story. He told investigators that on the very night of the murder, he had been with Carolyn at a local bar, then later in her car. That supposedly gave him an alibi. But here's the critical error. Instead of rigorously questioning whether Paul's story was truthful, police seemed to accept it at face value. They never properly verified his timeline. They never pressed him on the inconsistencies in his account. Instead, Carolyn Warmus was immediately cast as the jealous other woman. Detectives painted a picture of her as obsessed with Paul, furious at Betty Jeanne for standing in the way of their relationship. To the media, it was irresistible. A young, attractive teacher, a suburban affair, a wife found murdered. It was the perfect tabloid recipe. Within months, Carolyn went from lover to murder suspect. One of the most shocking investigative failures was how police handled Paul Solomon's obvious conflicts of interest. Remember, when officers arrived, Paul reportedly had blood on his hands, which they allowed him to wash away. His account of the evening contained multiple inconsistencies. He gave confusing information when calling for help, and his shifting stories left gaps that were never properly resolved. But rather than pressing Paul harder, investigators made a stunning decision. They granted him immunity in exchange for his testimony against Carolyn Warmus. Let that sink in. The man who stood to gain financially from his wife's death. The man who had blood on his hands. The man with inconsistent statements. He was given a complete pass. Instead, detectives poured all their energy into building a case against Carolyn. By the time Carolyn was officially indicted, the media had already branded her with a label she could never escape: the Fatal Attraction Killer. Reporters constantly compared her to Glenn Close's character in the 1987 film Fatal Attraction, an obsessive woman who couldn't let go of her married lover and eventually turned violent. It was catchy, it was cinematic, and it was devastatingly prejudicial. Before Carolyn ever set foot in a courtroom, the public believed they already knew her story. Prosecutors leaned heavily into that narrative, shaping their entire case around jealousy and obsession rather than hard evidence. But here's the problem. Hard evidence was exactly what this case lacked. So what did prosecutors bring to court? No eyewitnesses saw Carolyn near the crime scene. No one spotted her car in the area. No physical evidence. No fingerprints. No hair. No fibers placed her in Betty Jeanne's apartment that night. What they had instead were circumstantial fragments. A private investigator claimed he sold Carolyn a gun with a silencer, though the actual murder weapon was never recovered. Prosecutors argued she had the classic motive of jealousy. They painted her as temperamental and persistent in pursuing Paul. It wasn't a mountain of evidence. It was a story. And in the American justice system, compelling stories can sometimes be just as powerful as facts. Carolyn Warmus's first trial began in 1991. The prosecution leaned heavily on Paul Solomon's testimony, painting Carolyn as obsessed, desperate, and capable of murder. The private investigator repeated his claim about selling her a weapon. The state argued that Carolyn had simply snapped, killing Betty Jeanne in a jealous rage. But without direct evidence, the jury struggled to reach a unanimous verdict. The result? A hung jury. For most defendants, a hung jury might mean freedom, or at least a fresh start. But for Carolyn, it meant something else entirely. It gave prosecutors time to regroup and strengthen their case. And during that gap, something very strange happened. A new piece of evidence mysteriously appeared. At the original crime scene in 1989, investigators photographed a single black leather glove lying near Betty Jeanne Solomon's body. But here's where the story gets bizarre. That glove was never collected as evidence. No evidence tag. No chain of custody documentation. It was simply noted in crime scene photographs, and then it vanished. For nearly 3 years, that glove was missing. It didn't surface during the first trial. Jurors never heard about it. The prosecution never mentioned it. Then, just before the second trial, Paul Solomon suddenly claimed he had found it in his own bedroom closet. Think about how extraordinary that is. A husband discovers the most crucial piece of evidence in his wife's murder case, years later, inside his own home. And instead of treating this development with extreme suspicion, prosecutors welcomed it with open arms. This glove, despite its completely broken chain of custody, became the centerpiece of the state's case against Carolyn Warmus. Chain of custody is absolutely everything in criminal investigations. If you can't prove where evidence came from and who handled it, then you simply cannot trust it in court. In this case, the glove had no reliable chain of custody whatsoever. It was photographed at the crime scene. It wasn't collected by forensics. It disappeared for years. It magically appeared in Paul Solomon's closet, the very man who had immunity for testifying against Carolyn. Despite these massive problems, the judge allowed it into evidence. The prosecution argued the glove belonged to Carolyn Warmus, claiming microscopic fibers on it matched those found in Betty Jean's home. The defense countered that Carolyn had been a guest at the Solomon home previously, so any fiber transfer could have been completely innocent. More importantly, they argued, how could anyone trust evidence that had been missing for years? But in the eyes of the jury, the glove carried tremendous weight. It was tangible. It was something they could see and touch. And prosecutors knew exactly how powerful that would be. In 1992, Carolyn Warmus faced trial again. This time, the prosecution was armed with a mysteriously reappeared glove, Paul Solomon's testimony, and the same powerful narrative of a jealous, obsessed lover. The courtroom was packed with reporters. The public couldn't get enough of the so-called fatal attraction murder. That Hollywood nickname followed Carolyn everywhere. Tabloid headlines constantly featured her face next to Glenn Close's. Before the first witness even testified, the jury had been marinating in that cinematic storyline for years. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned their verdict in January 1992. Carolyn Warmus was found guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Carolyn, who had once been a promising young teacher, would spend the next 27 years in a maximum security prison. Her supporters argued she wasn't convicted on evidence. She was convicted on a story, a Hollywood script, and that suspicious glove had sealed her fate. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is what happened after the conviction. By the mid-1990s, DNA testing had revolutionized criminal justice. Cases once thought closed were being reopened. Innocent people were walking free after decades behind bars. But when Carolyn requested DNA testing on the evidence used to convict her, she was repeatedly blocked. She wanted the glove tested. She wanted blood samples analyzed. She wanted any scientific proof that could definitively establish her guilt or innocence. For years, the system said no. Courts cited technicalities, procedural hurdles, and bureaucratic excuses. Carolyn sat in prison while the science that might have freed her remained unused. This wasn't just unfair. It was a betrayal of justice itself. Carolyn Warmus entered prison at age 28. By the time she walked out in 2019, she was 55 years old. She had spent nearly 3 decades inside Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, maintaining her innocence every single day. 2 years after her release, in 2021, prosecutors finally agreed to DNA testing. The results were mixed and inconclusive. DNA from the glove included material from at least one unidentified male. Crucially, it was not Carolyn's DNA. But much of the evidence was too degraded after decades of storage to provide definitive answers. Here's the tragedy. If that glove had been tested in 1992, the results could have changed everything. By 2021, too much had been lost to time. Through it all, one person remained strangely untouched: Paul Solomon, Betty Jean's husband, the man who admitted to multiple affairs, the man who found the crucial glove in his own closet years later, the man whose story contained multiple inconsistencies. He was granted immunity for his testimony, and after Carolyn's conviction, he faded from the spotlight entirely. Critics argue that investigators never seriously pursued him as a suspect, despite clear red flags that should have warranted intense scrutiny. So what do we really know about the Carolyn Warmus case? We know the investigation was riddled with catastrophic mistakes. We know the glove, the star piece of evidence, had no proper chain of custody. We know prosecutors resisted DNA testing for decades. And we know the man closest to the victim walked away completely untouched. The ultimate question remains: did Carolyn Warmus murder Betty Jeanne Solomon? Or did a fundamentally flawed investigation, combined with sensational media coverage, send an innocent woman to prison for nearly 3 decades? The Carolyn Warmus case is more than just a scandalous tabloid story. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when investigations go wrong, when prosecutors chase narratives instead of truth, and when the media becomes judge, jury, and executioner. Carolyn Warmus served 27 years in prison. DNA testing may never fully clear her name, but her case stands as a stark reminder that justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about fairness, truth, and accountability. And when those fundamental principles are abandoned, we have to ask ourselves, was it just Betty Jeanne Solomon who was murdered that night in 1989? Or was justice itself killed along the way? What do you think happened in the Carolyn Warmus case? Was she a calculated killer, or the victim of a botched investigation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this case shocked you as much as it shocked me, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Because the truth is often stranger than fiction, and sometimes the real criminals are the ones who never face trial.